Hi, it's John Reites, your host at Inclusion Criteria. Thanks for spending time to listen to today's episode. If you're new to Inclusion Criteria, if you've been listening to some of our earlier episodes, you'll know that a lot of our focus is on supporting you in your career in clinical trials, but also focused on delivering insights that can help you stay ahead of where the market is moving. Today's episode is no exception. We've spent episodes focused on topics, Q&A, and expert interviews like today. If you get a chance and you want to learn more about inclusion criteria or sign up for our newsletter so you can not miss any episode, you can go to johnreites.com, click on the link and sign up. You can also subscribe in any podcast apps and on YouTube. Today's episode, I'm excited to share, is with expert Julio Martinez-Clark. Now, Julio is the CEO of BioAccess, and what I really like about Julio is that he's passionate, that he is knowledgeable, and then he has deep expertise in helping people to do clinical trials in Latin America. And so our focus in this conversation was, how do we accelerate, and how can our biopharma and biotech colleagues, how can they accelerate their work by thinking about implementing their studies in Latin America, and not just being focused on the traditional countries that most people think about, but looking at some of the more emerging countries that are starting to do clinical trials and starting to come up with regulations that speed up their ability to deliver. So again, that's our episode today. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much. Just for our audience today, we want to talk about Latin America. And Sure. You've got some insights that I think are really important for our listeners. And I think we're going to dig in and have a great conversation about it on Inclusion Criteria today. So thanks for spending time. So kick us off. Who is Julio? What do you do in clinical research?
I am the CEO of BioAccess. We are the leading first-in-human contract research organization based out of Miami that helps U.S. and some European startups with their early feasibility, first-in-human medical device and biopharma. And now we're also getting into the radiopharmaceutical space. We've been doing this for about 20 years. And it started inside the University of Miami. And I'm very excited to be with you today, John.
Tell us, by starting out, what makes Latin America such a prime location for clinical trials?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the problem that we're trying to solve for. As you know, doing trials, especially first-in-human ones, for startups in the U.S. Can be very challenging, meaning challenging in the recruitment of patients for risky trials, especially with implantable high-risk devices. Second is costly. I mean, the procedures, the healthcare procedures in the United States is expensive. And third, the time it takes to get these trials approved. The IRBs, we have these large hospital systems. You have to navigate those systems and the bureaucracy and have all these 20 meetings to agree to one meeting. And then the IRB approval takes forever because these are high risky trials. So companies are looking for places where they can start these trials faster, easier, and cheaper. And meaning that they can recruit patients at a faster pace than in the United States and gather the clinical data. So Latin America has several advantages. First of all, it's right next to the United States. It's right in the backyard. So geographic location is just perfect. You don't have to go across the world to do a trial in Eastern Europe or anything like that. Although we also have an operation in Eastern Europe, but we love Latin America because it's just faster to fly. You have also faster approvals. I mean, places like Panama, you can get approvals in 15 days. We just got a trial approved from a sponsor from the UK. It's an innovation from Oxford University. The company is called Neurotex. It's public information. There's a press release about this because we were so excited we needed to announce it to the world. We got approvals in 15 days in Panama, which is record. So, and at lower cost than in the United States, of course.
You said 15 days. Like
15 days after submission. Yeah.
That's crazy.
Calendar days. Yes.
That's awesome.
It's really crazy.
Congratulations.
Yes.
That's
Thank
a
you.
big deal. Yeah.
It's a big deal, yeah.
Maybe zoom out for a minute too, because one of the things that I find it's similar to when I have a conversation with a biopharma about going into Africa. I say, where do you want to go in Africa? And they say Africa. And they say, well, it's a really big place. And
Yeah.
There's lots of countries to go.
Yeah.
And I actually think, not all the time, but I think sometimes someone will say, oh, we should be in Latin America. And we go, great, which countries? And they go, the Latin American ones that we always do research in. And I think there's sort of this like no one knows how to pin down like what the top recruiters are, or maybe feels as confident as they should about what countries are there and available, and do a lot of research very normally for a long period of time. So unpack for us, like, what are some of the specific Latin American countries that are obviously consistently used in global clinical trials, but then maybe talk about some of the ones that are getting upstarts. Like you mentioned Panama,
Yes.
which is not one that hits many's list. So
Exactly.
I think maybe give us a flavor for who does everybody go to, and then who's kind of up and coming as the countries
Sure.
that people should be thinking about in their next study.
Yeah. Of course, you have the usual suspects, Brazil, because of the size of the country. Brazil's population is 220-something million people. It's a large country. So
that's right.
a lot of trials happen in Brazil, especially now that the government just passed a new law about a year and a half ago that is making the approval of these trials a lot faster. And you have, of course, Mexico, also a large country, 125 million people. And you have Argentina, which is also a country of about 40-something million people, and has a very expedited way of approving trials. They passed a law in 2017, if I remember correctly. So those are usually the places where companies go for clinical research. However, it's important, John, to make a distinction when just like somebody tells you, let's go to Latin America, it's a very generic statement or question. How do you define Latin America? So same thing with clinical trials. How do you define a clinical trial? Are we talking about later phases for pharma, or are we talking about early phases for also pharma or devices? So my specialty is more in the first in human, early phase, device trials, although we also have experience and we have an operation for biopharma startups. But traditionally, we have focused on medtech clinical trials, helping U.S. medtech startups approve these trials faster. So anyway, the point is that, yes, the bigger countries attract a lot of biopharma investment, especially for later phases. But for first in human phases, you see newer countries like Panama, as we just mentioned, El Salvador, believe it or not, is really attracting investment in clinical research, and they're doing anything possible to become friendlier to this industry, especially as we all know, because of the news, the country has been in war for many years. So it's now a transformed economy. I just went to El Salvador recently, and I was really shocked with what I saw. Very safe, clean, very organized, and just open for business. Yeah, we're doing 2 studies in El Salvador right now as we speak. The other country where we also have a lot of success is the Dominican Republic. If we're looking at countries that are in the northern part of Latin America. But in the south, you have Chile. Chile is an awesome country. Paraguay is also an awesome country. So those are kind of the upcoming countries. However, the timing of this recording is perfect because just a couple of days ago, on August 5th, Colombia Colombian congressmen just submitted a new bill for a new law to be approved, and it's going to make Colombia one of the best countries in the world, probably, to do clinical research. And the law in Colombia hasn't been updated in about 30-something years, 35 years or so. Wow. So it was about time that Colombia updates the law. And it gets aligned with the other countries in Latin America that are also updating their laws. And they started first because there is a trend in the region to receive more trials. So governments have realized that clinical research is a huge industry that benefits patients, benefits the local economies, and also transfers advanced knowledge to the local investigators.
I think one of the things for me that's always been really interesting. You've been a big proponent of this. It's how we ran into each other so many times over the years with clinical trials. Is what accelerated look like. What a timelines for acceleration look like. And I think sometimes operators in clinical trials come to think about the countries and they think about timelines in Europe, right? And MHRA timelines. They think about Asia Pac and they think about timelines to get through RA and local EC and central EC. But when you come into LATAM, there's actually a different model there, and you really actually can accelerate your regulatory status pretty quickly, right? If you get your upfront submission done right. So maybe for everybody who's sort of curious about what that looks like, can you give a flavor of what accelerated timelines look like, and maybe some of the countries that are at that top tier versus some of the ones that maybe look like traditional timelines, but people should be aware of?
Yes, I think there is a direct correlation between the size of the country and the regulatory complexity and the regulatory timeline. So if we start with smaller countries like Panama, Salvador, Dominican Republic, you can get a trial approved as fast as 15 days, as we just mentioned, to about 90 days in the case of the Dominican Republic. El Salvador is kind of in the middle. Same in Chile. Chile is a pretty fast country because in Panama and Chile, you don't have to go to the National Regulatory Agency for approval. You just notify them, which is great. So as soon as you get IRB approval, you can start recruiting patients because you are dealing with a local IRB. It's a private institution where things usually move faster. In countries like El Salvador, you have to do a sequential approval, IRB, and then Ministry of Health approval, but it's pretty fast. I mean, in probably 60 days, you can get a trial approved in El Salvador. Dominican Republic takes about 90. It also needs a sequential submission. And that's usually the case in the rest of the countries. If you go to Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, you're probably talking about after IRB submission, which is usually fast because, again, it's a private institution. Smaller usually, and you don't have to deal with large hospital systems, large bureaucracy or anything like that. So the IRB approval timeline in pretty much all countries is anywhere between 30 and 45 days. After that, you go to the National Regulatory Agency or Ministry of Health, and that's where usually the bottleneck starts in the larger countries. In the case of Mexico, you can spend about anywhere between 4 and 6 months at COFEPRIS. In the case of Anvisa, you can probably spend 3 to 6 months, although with the new law, it should be faster. Anvisa in Brazil. In Argentina and MAT, you should probably spend about 4 months at the regulatory agency after IRB approval. Yeah.
For a lot of people, there's some really accelerated timelines in there. Like that's right after the U.S. And then at the same time, you got some that would line up or stack with your European and some of your newer Asia Pac countries. But that's accelerated, and I think I think that's a great point because I think we, again, sort of packages Latin America. I am seeing personally a large increase in clients who are talking about LATAM countries. And they are thinking strategically about them right up front with their U.S. and European placements. And that's really phenomenal, right? And because, like we've done a lot of work in LATAM before, and they're consistent recruiters, right?
Yes.
Like that's really been one of the big advantages and I think a lot of people, right, when we think about what the goal of this is to be able to get in a country, to help the patients in that country and get connected to sites that can not just get up quickly, because they can get up as quickly as they want. If they can't recruit the patients, who cares? So this ability to recruit the patients is so positive. And I personally, I've just had a lot of success in seeing our customers recruit in LATAM countries. And I think it's just a big proponent of what they bring to the table. On the flip side, though, Julio, I think there's sort of misconceptions is the word I'm going to use, right? Like some people come in and they think about they have like, I did a study in Mexico 20 years ago and this happened. And so they sort of carry that with them. And we're like, whoa, right? You know that. So where you're at in your position, you see and hear these misconceptions all the time. What are some of the top misconceptions, and how do we help break those down or remove them for people that maybe have an outdated position on how to work in LATAM in their studies?
Yes. Well, the first one I think is, let's start with quality. That the quality is not good. That the FDA is not going to accept the data because it's bad quality, things like that. I usually get that question. And to answer that, I'm going to cite an example. It's an event that happened late last year. Velocity Research just announced opening a new office in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Velocity Research is the largest site network in the world, right? So that's a major player making a move into Latin America. And when I read that, I also read about another private equity. Velocity Research, by the way, is private equity money back in this large site network. And also another, I think was Scope or something like that, they announced in around November, December, their acquisition of a second site in Brazil. So Velocity Research and this other network, they're buying sites in Brazil, in Mexico, in Argentina. So that's a validation of the space, I think. The other comment that I can make, John, is the fact that there is a global international standard for clinical research now. It's a global certification, site certification to ensure quality. It's called the International Accrediting Organization for Clinical Research out of the UK. And they started certifying sites that are part of the NHS, the National Health System in the UK. And they have expanded to about 40 different countries. And they're expanding rapidly in Latin America. And it's been around for about 5 years, and it was created by the industry, for the industry, backed by the big CROs, because we all need a global site certification that ensures the excellency of the processes at a research site. So that kind of takes care of the quality. And also, the FDA accepts data as long as you gather the data following international ICH GCP standards. There are guideline documents on this on the FDA's website. So that's that. The second comment that I usually get is recruitment. And this is a very interesting topic, John, because in emerging economies, usually the healthcare system is public. As you know how it is. I mean, if the government runs a healthcare system, most of the population is part of the public healthcare system, especially in emerging countries, even in Canada. Then you hear about people waiting to make appointments, waiting months to get a treatment. It's just access to the system is just difficult, especially in countries in Latin America. And so if a sponsor comes offering a clinical trial to a patient, a sponsor or an investigator offers a clinical trial to a patient, the patient will be delighted to participate because it's the only way that patient can have access to the system, quality access to the system, and be treated with dignity, right? So that's a big benefit. You don't have to pay patients in Latin America to participate in clinical trials, actually. It's not customary. Because you don't need to, because the patient is already seeing the benefit of having fast access and quality access to the system.
Yeah, it's like in the US, we talk about clinical as a care option, and we're trying to convince people to sort of say, hey, you're getting care, think about clinical. And what you're saying is actually the opposite, which is it really is a care option to think about first, where clinical is the first option. And I think it's always been a phenomenal option that I don't think we think about the same way. So no, those are good. And I'm sure there's lots of other misconceptions. If people have them, I would encourage you to do two things. One is to take your misconceptions and put them aside for a second.
Yeah.
Right. So we all know I've had them too, where I'm like, oh, I did this 15 years ago and this is what happened. And I talk to an expert who does it every day and I go, John, that hasn't happened in 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
First, break them down. But second is just call Julio and ask him what's actually happening in the countries, and you can get a realistic, time-stamped opinion because I think those are right. And you're right. There's a big shift and a big move, and it's not lost on me that you're seeing site networks. You're seeing research sites in the U.S. expand their collaborations in LATAM. There's been a lot of those announcements. The Velocity one, shout out to Paul Evans. I think there's a lot happening there that's really moving the needle, and it should.
Agreed.
So when you think about delivering on recruitment, right, what a lot of pharma and a lot of biotech are obviously dealing with right now is they have studies up. There's a lot of competition, right? Especially when you think about the markets around med device, GLP-1s. I mean, think about all the competition that's out there. And so they're also looking to go to countries where they can compete more against others that are out in the traditional countries. And so I actually think the reason we're seeing a really big push in wanting to select LATAM countries is to have more optionality, because you kind of see the same customers in the same countries over and over again. They need a more of a competitive advantage. So if you're talking to a biotech who's saying, hey, I haven't gone this country before, I need a competitive advantage, where do you send them first? Like, what countries? Like, what's kind of the micro strategy you give them to say, hey, here's how I would think about exploring LATAM. Like, here's where I would start to get the information you need to make a good decision and move fast to be competitive by using country or countries in LATAM.
Yes. Usually the strategy calls that I have with my clients, John, center around how fast can we activate a site. But you have to balance that with your patient recruitment potential. And that also is linked to the inclusion and exclusion criteria, right? What I mean is that if I get you a study approved in Panama in 15 days, as we recently did with this sponsor from the UK, but if the inclusion and exclusion criteria is so narrow, and or the prevalence of the disease is not really there, then it's going to be difficult to recruit patients in Panama, even though you got fast approval. So you have to balance those two aspects: fast approval or time to approval versus patient recruitment potential. In my opinion, those are very important variables in the equation to before you strategize where to go. Usually our clients are startup companies. They all want fast approvals. And they are usually researching they're usually involved in therapeutic areas that are fairly common, cardiology or orthopedics, ophthalmology. So those are pretty common all over the country, all over the region. So we haven't really had a study where we cannot recruit in a smaller country like Panama, because it's just a handful then we have to say, no, Panama is not the place, let's go to a larger country. Just a handful. Usually we can land a study, we can activate a site in smaller countries and get fast approvals.
Well, and that's good advice, because actually it's very consistent with how if I'm in a biopharma, I'm in a biotech, I'm doing the same evaluation in Europe, in Asia-Pac, in North America. So this ability to think the same way, but maybe just give a shot at looking through LATAM countries as a part of the strategy, not just because that's already on your map, but because it could give you a competitive advantage. I think it's just really important.
Also, if you're a biopharma company that has the goal of selling a product in those economies, as you alluded to initially, where companies are now thinking about Latin America as a target market, also beyond the typical traditional markets like the US or Europe. If you want to sell your product eventually in Mexico or in Brazil or any of these countries, it is smart to start with a trial there. You gather data, you do your submissions at the FDA or in Europe, and it's usually faster and cheaper to get market clearance in Brazil or in Colombia or Mexico or in Argentina, larger countries where you can start generating revenue if you're a startup. That is really important. You don't have to wait.
Well said.
Yeah, exactly. And also you have a foothold. You already, since you did the study in that country, you already established relationships with key opinion leaders, with hospitals, and then it's going to be easier to bring the product to the market.
Last question I have. You and I could talk about this for hours, and we have, but we could. So maybe one of the things I'm always interested in, I think I ask you this all the time when we catch up, is how's the technology landscape changed? So when I think about LATAM in general, and I think about research sites and patients that we're trying to serve, right, that we're trying to make easier to participate in clinical trials, and one of the ways we do that is we leverage technology.
Yes.
When you're thinking about technology use, mobile access, the sort of the expertise and experience that's now been built up over the last few years, what's the advice? What do you tell people that say, I want to take all my tech to Latin America? Like, how do you help them either understand where they're going to really win, or maybe where they are going to have some gaps and need to think a little differently in their strategy?
I think it's pretty relevant now. I mean, the internet penetration and also the mobile penetration of Latin America is one of the highest in the world, actually.
That's right.
And
I think
one
Brazil
of the
was actually,
yes,
like Brazil was the #1 most connected country for a long time.
Exactly, something like that.
Yeah.
And a reason for that is because I used to work in the telecom and networking industry. I worked for Lucent and Nortel, so I was involved with telephone exchanges and things like that. And I was born and raised in Colombia, and for you to get a phone line at your house, you needed to wait probably 2 or 3 years. Imagine, to buy a phone line for your house. When I was growing up, that was the case. You could see ads in the newspaper of people selling their phone lines. So there was a secondary market for phone lines. Yes. So what I'm saying with this is that the telecom providers in Latin America, they were usually government providers. The state had the monopoly of telecommunications in the country. And just recently, that opened up to private investors, but just recently. So if you have that situation, when cell phones became cheaper and more common, people were just running to buy cell phones because it was their solution to the issue of not having a phone line. So that's why Latin America is one of the most connected places around the world. And also you have these Chinese manufacturers inundating the market. So you have very inexpensive cell phones that anybody on the streets can purchase. They're pretty disposable nowadays. So everybody's connected, everybody uses apps, and it's fairly common to do trials. Actually, there are companies doing trials with telemonitoring. We were involved in a study. We were doing a medical device study on an implantable device for chronic venous insufficiency. And we gave our patients, after the implantation, we needed patients to walk. We needed a way to really measure the amount of steps they were taking every day. So we gave them a watch, a special watch that was connected to their cell phone. And we successfully recorded their activity levels with that.
I think the take-home message here, and we've seen the same thing. We're running studies, lots of them right now, fully connected telehealth visits in phase 3 clinical trials in LATAM on a regular basis. And so I think when I get asked the question, which is, well, how is there connectivity gaps or connectivity issues? And I'm like, actually, these countries have better connectivity than we do in the U.S.
Yeah, probably.
I think some people are a little surprised. But it's like you said, they moved to this mobile-first model where we all had landlines and moved.
Yes,
we were there
exactly.
First, like you said. And you're a young man to have to wait that long for a cabled phones. But listen, this has been, Julio, super helpful for our audience. Everybody, I hope that this gives you at least something to think about when you're strategically looking at adding countries to your study as a biopharma biotech. If you're in a CRO, you're thinking about how do I work with and what countries and what are happening in Latin America. There is a lot happening every single day. And I would just encourage, and I hope you're hearing it from Julio today, that there is opportunity, there are willing countries, and there are countries that excel in performing available to you in Latin America. So, my friend, thank you so much for spending time with me. It's great to see you.
Thank you, John.